If you haven't discovered this for yourself, heed some words of Unity author and minister Eric Butterworth. Unity is probably the most difficult religious discipline in the world, simply because you are face to face with God and with yourself. There is nowhere to go, no one to blame, nothing to hide behind. You realize that your life experience is the result of your keeping of the law, that God can do no more for you than God can do through you, with the responsibility upon you of disciplining your thinking. Ouch. Bad news. Really? Good news. Yes. We are called to live in this awareness that Mr. Butterworth speaks of, to know that that power can only express through us. The movement of God can only be present at the level of our consciousness, of the level of our connectedness to that energy. So living fully, living successfully, living consciously asks us to keep the law of God, which is the law of love, to step fully into this infinite presence so that we may walk in life well equipped, walk in strength, able to bring a sense of divine order to our life and to see the expression of divine order in the world. We look beyond the stuff that's going on in the world because that is never the higher truth. Think of what's going on in the world around us right now and recognize that does not express the truth of God. It expresses a reflection of our lesser consciousness collectively. Maybe I'm not responsible for what the government looks like right now. I may not be individually responsible for the pandemic, but I have a role to play in setting the consciousness in which these circumstances spin and play out in our world. Today we look for, on Aloha Sunday, the wisdom we find from a great treasure of Hawaii, Dr. Mary Kavenapukui, who collected wise sayings and proverbs from the Hawaiian culture from ancient times forward to when she compiled this work. This was a lifelong work for Dr. Pukui. And the beauty of these sayings often reflect our unity principles, the spiritual principles that underline our movement, our faith, and our teachings are found in the wisdom of many traditions, including our local Hawaiian spiritual culture. Today, I've chosen a proverb, Pūpūkāhi I holomua, which means simply unite in order to progress. Well, what do we unite with, you wonder? We, as metaphysicians, unite with this sense of self, with the presence of God. We are governed by the laws of the spiritual universe, as well as we are governed by the laws of man, the laws of the state, the laws of temporal life. But the higher law, when that comes through, then life shifts for us. Maybe it only shifts right here in my little corner when I get a hold of the spiritual truth that transcends the law of the land. But if I hold that deeply and consciously moving forward in my life from that place, then I impact others around me. That ripples out into positive effect for others. Maybe in my own family, my circle of friends, my spiritual community, my Zoom communities these days. Wherever we gather, we have the opportunity to express the highest truth we know and to reach for the truth even beyond that. Because as far as I can tell about my own life, I am not yet living to the fullness of the message of Jesus. I strive for it, but I also have my feet firmly planted all too often in my human experience, in my who, in my personality, as opposed to my what, my highest consciousness, my divine nature. And so we are always seeking to grow past the limitation of our ego, of our personal self, so that we can more consciously express the divine nature, the divine truth, the divine self. As Mr. Butterworth said, in keeping the law of God and the law of love, God can more fully express through us and evidence itself in the world. Now, we are in kind of some interesting times this year. I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like I've lived a decade in these 8-9 months since the first of the year, since early this year. A lot is going on. And I know maybe sometimes we could feel a little bit like our friend Kermit the Frog in this illustration, where please, not one more minute of 2020, I need to get out of this calendar period of time, because when we turn the page, we are hopeful for something new. You know, that is our human mind and our desire to escape the tension and anxiety and pressure we sometimes feel when we don't have our consciousness raised high enough. We need to practice the presence of God daily, regularly, and consistently, as Brother Lawrence says, which places in our hands spiritual tools that lift us above this fray of human conditions. And I'm ready to be above the fray regularly. If we look around us at the current state of affairs in our world, it's been 7-8 months of a pandemic. Here in the United States, we're in the midst of an election process. And the government looks, I don't know, maybe this is just me, the whole governmental process, the election, the Congress, collectively, it all looks a little tilted into crazy from my perspective sometimes. And I recognize that there's just a lot going on in the world where lives are in upheaval, whether it's a loss of job, whether it's a medical diagnosis, whether it's the health of yourself or your family, the well-being. We are all feeling that tension from time to time. And so we are called to the deeper awareness that God is present, even in the midst of us, so that we can reach for that higher understanding, that we can reach for that strength and that courage to nourish us and nurture us in the midst of whatever life is showing us. You know, my home state is Washington. And I read in the news this week that they've discovered a nest of the Asian gigantic hornet or whatever. Now, I grew up with bees and hornets and wasps in that part of the country, but I never saw anything as large as my thumb, with wings and an appetite. And that's a little, disconcerting. I'm glad I live in Hawaii right now. I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful, moreover, that in the spite of what looks like a little craziness and a little tilted planet on the axis kind of feeling, there is always this consistent, solid foundation available to me, centered in my deep awareness of the presence of God. You know, spiritual writers have been talking about such issues for decades. Our movement is founded on the writings of Charles Fillmore, who also respected other authors and other spiritual teachers. And this idea that we can govern ourselves more effectively when we are centered in a higher consciousness is pervasive through many spiritual teachers. There was one minister who even wrote and quoted some writings of Carl Jung after World War II. He made the case that Hitler, in this instance, was simply a mirror for human consciousness. That which we define sometimes as evil, or in a very generous term, unconscious human behavior. Error thinking was Mr. Fillmore's term. Someone in that position can only reflect and is only a mirror for what the collective consciousness of humanity is representing in that time period. We know that each of us, carry that shadow, and they're operating from fear rather than faith. And Jung said that this just shows us our lost quality. It is a reflection for us to know, to guide us toward that higher thinking. But when we are stuck in that place of the shadow or our fear or our judgment and criticism or our worry and anxiety, then we're like someone listening to a stream of suggestions in a whispered voice from some mysterious source that we think might be true, and so we choose to act upon them. I don't know about Hitler and Germany in the post-World War II era, but I can recognize some of that present in contemporary times right now, right here. That what goes on in our culture, in our society, when there's all this upheaval. We're suffering from the effects of the pandemic in our economy. We are struggling with issues of social justice and how to effectively respond to that in our society. Goodness sakes, there are murder hornets to be found on the mainland. Whatever it is, this is a representation of our collective unconscious thinking. And so we are invited to lift our place into a different realm of thinking, to the higher consciousness that is the kingdom of God that Jesus spoke of. And we do that by employing the full power of prayer and the law of love, the spiritual laws of love. What we understand is that when we are seen unconscious and unthinking and fearful and anxiety-producing individuals out there, we can't work to repair that in that arena. Remember Dr. Einstein's advice is we cannot solve a problem at the same level of consciousness in which the problem was created. So while our reaching for that higher consciousness might lead us to some right action in the face of what we see, it should be right action based in the law of love. We should be led to that right action through prayer and meditation, so that what we are responding to is the sense of wholeness and the energy of God that wants to express in the world through us. So when we come first to govern ourselves through the laws of love and the power of prayer, then we can send that ripple out to have effect in the laws of man. And we can contribute to the positive governance of our community and our world, the positive governance even of our family, that we can shape our influence, the positive effect we can have in the world through the power of love and the power of prayer. What Mr. Fillmore often wrote about was his grieving the notion that in the greater Christian community, what often took place was we developed the worship of Jesus as the personality. And we told the stories about his lessons, and we told the stories of his great miracles 2,000 years ago. And maybe we didn't speak it, but there was something in the human mind that said, that was then. And that may not have real value in this moment for me now. And what I am here to tell you is what Jesus taught us is how to live fully in that other consciousness that can step away from the fear and the anxiety and the concern of our human lives. Yes, we deal with the activities of our daily life, but can we govern ourselves in consciousness so that we can move through any experience with a sense of equanimity, knowing that the harmony of God is in the midst of all of it, can be found beyond the looking at the conditions in the world if we just seek that space of greater understanding. Mr. Fillmore called this the ignorance of the principles which Jesus taught. And he said that there are millions of ministers in the world. There are billions of church resources, dollars worth of resources in the world. We have the largest following of any faith on the planet. And yet the Christ energy, the Christ consciousness, the mind of Christ, and the laws of God seldom have a revered space in the agencies and institutions of our government. Often you wonder if the laws of love are present in our leaders based on observation of behavior. So it's up to us to be that living presence of God in the world and to reflect that law of love so that we bring the kingdom of God here and now present in this moment. From Butterworth's description of unity and our personal responsibility to Carl Jung and Fillmore and other authors that talk about this idea of governance. It moves through from the personal to the community to the world. And we have the capacity to be a positive influence for all of it. And the Bible tells us that this is not just a contemporary issue or something that Carl Jung wrote about in the mid-1900s. No, this is an age-old question, an age-old issue of how to be a responsible citizen and how to live effectively in the world. How do we contribute to the positive life? What's our individual responsibility? Now, Paul wrote a letter to the Roman community. This was a church community that he himself did not found, but he was going to visit. And it was apparently a thriving community of those who were following the way, the teachings of Jesus. In Rome, the seat of the Roman Empire, which didn't always look favorably upon the early Christians and their teachings of Jesus. I mean, after all, they executed him. And so Paul is trying to set the tone for his visit to Rome, to this community, from his understanding of the teachings of Jesus. Now, let's understand that Paul was an intellectual, and he could interpret the language of Jesus and the laws that he taught. But still, it was an interpretation. What Jesus taught was the absolute truth. And Paul's great role in the history of the Christian church is to interpret those teachings into daily life and to seed communities around the civilized world at that time. So let me read you a chapter or a portion of a chapter. We're looking at Romans 13, verses 1 to 12. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Imagine if we thought that was true of our own government. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. How amazing if we saw our public officials as our servants for God's good. Continuing. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Fulfilling the law through love is where Paul then takes us. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Besides this, you know the time that the hour has come for you to wake from your sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone and the day is at hand. So let us cast off the words of darkness and put on the armor of light. Now, we know a little bit about the history of the time. The early Christians didn't fare so well in Rome. And so it's kind of interesting to read Paul suggesting that following the laws of man and being subject to that authority is wise and just. I believe Paul was talking to us from the place of a higher perspective of what it could look like if that was the attitude we each held. If we held our governing authorities with respect, if we observed all of the laws that we have in place to keep the structure of our society whole, and if we gave respect to those laws and to those representatives. So as Paul wrote to this fledgling Christian church in Rome, he was presenting his own credentials, if you will, his understanding of Jesus' teachings. And he went to offer them a clear message as he understands it. Since this group is at the very center of the current political power at that time, the city of Rome, we look at the relations between those believers and the contrasting Roman government and know that it did not always go easy for the believers. But Paul chooses carefully in his message to them ahead of his journey to affirm and see that the state, the Roman government, is just and beneficent, that they are expressing God's will and maintaining the sense of divine order. He's trying to instill this affirmative viewpoint in the community because what they hold may be outpictured in their experience. This is a view from divine order, choosing to see it rightly past the circumstances of what seem to exist. He's describing an ideal situation in which human governments exist to express and carry out our collective spiritual purpose, to hold ourselves to a higher standard, not only individually as we come into self-governance with this truth that God can only express through us. And so what do we choose that to look like? but we come into governance of our community and our state and our country through the ideals of higher spiritual principles. When governments are out of alignment with this spiritual role, it's often because collectively we are out of alignment with the presence, power, and activity of God. But we have that chance to turn back to the awareness of God anytime we make an observation. You know, a friend and colleague shared with me a spiritual practice that she began, just about 4 years ago. This would not be in alignment with her personal thinking, but she connected to our president's Twitter account. And she used this as a spiritual practice, recognizing that if we're seeing something out there in the world and we have a judgment about it, we are called to connect to that higher awareness and see what purpose it serves, see how we might be showing up individually in this manner, in this personality, in this way that we would have a judgment about. And it freed her from tension around the current political situation. Now, that works for whatever side of the political aisle you might be on and whoever you are in disagreement with. Got a family member who doesn't think the same as you on, name a topic? Well, join them on Facebook and engage in seeing their perspective and knowing that it serves to call you to a deeper awareness of your own thinking. And from that higher awareness of God manifesting through this experience, how can you respond better in the world? How can you respond from a higher place of consciousness that affects everything around you? In the Jewish law, before the time of Christ, the law was intended to bring order into the society. That's the general purpose of laws, to keep control in a smooth and harmonious way. Well, when we can transcend the laws of our government, the laws of our state, and listen first to the law of God, which is the law of love, which is Jesus' great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, then we can come into this political arena. We can come into the tragedy of a pandemic, and we can say, I hold to something greater, and my action will be based in the wisdom that comes to me from listening to the voice of Spirit within. We will act to fulfill the law of love, not out of fearful disobedience, sort of what Paul described in the early verses. No, but out of loving creativity to bring the essence of God into greater manifestation in the world so that we see and experience more of God. We do this by finding that spiritual light of the understanding of these truths and then moving it, from our intellect to our heart so that we can live in a state of positive assurance that all is well. Wherever God is, I am. And all is well means wherever, whenever, and however it looks like out there, God and I are in a space where all is well, and I will hold myself in that truth. I will anchor in that clarity. One of the authors I was reading as I prepared for this week, I found a very unique prayer. And he spoke of the power of prayer transcending our human needs, responding to the desires of our hearts or the concerns we have for ourselves and those around us. But when we pray from that awareness that there is a higher consciousness, then we are truly putting the law of love into powerful effect. This prayer comes from an English New Thought author. He was a scientist and an engineer and a prolific writer and metaphysician. And in England, he developed his own prayer society, much more or less on the time frame with the Fillmores establishing the organization that became the Unity Christian School and our Unity Silent Prayer movement. He was a contemporary of the Fillmores in England, and he published this prayer. There is no danger. Man is surrounded by divine love. There is no matter. All is spirit and the manifestation of spirit. So I invite us, these next 8 or 9 days, I challenge us to see the world through that lens, that there is no danger to come to us. There is only the surrounding energy of God's divine love. That everything we look at is temporal, will be gone in some period of time. That all that we are looking at is fueled by spirit, by that divine energy, and is a manifestation of spirit. Can you look at everybody that troubles you right now and see them as an emanation of spirit? That's seeking and standing in the higher consciousness. Some of us were at the talent show last night on Zoom, which was also a time of some spiritual sharing. And one of our contributors to the talent, sharing his talents with us, is a gentleman who will be entering the licensed teacher path of training this next year. And so he's finishing up the last of his courses with Reverend Levitt, studying the eye of the storm. And this gentleman is a prolific songwriter. He's been a serious musician all of his life. You know, he turns out a song I think, about every week when he's in a prolifically creative period. At least that's what I've been witnessing through the flow of the weeks of the class. And on Saturday morning, he had a song to share with all of us in the group that was inspired by that book, The Eye of the Storm. Well, you missed a great performance. I want to just share a few choice words with you from composer Larry Harrell. Storms raging all around. Wherever I stand is holy ground. 'Cause right here in the eye of the storm, I choose love. Right here in the eye of my storm, I choose love. May that be your inclination, your calling, your inspiration, and your creative manifestation of the presence of God through you in the world this coming week. That you choose love, for that is what you truly are. Aloha. Namaste.